presentation will take us on a quick journey through 100 years that begins in the mid-19th century with the start of modern spiritualist movement and ends with the Festival of Britain just after the Second World War. I hope it will offer you a broad insight into several generations of British visionaries and how the eras in which they lived shaped their considerable achievements. It was a difficult choice, but the women I have selected to talk about were the 9 that demonstrated groundbreaking contributions to the history of mediumistic art, and also because they epitomize the verve of all our visionary sisters. They were true visionaries in both senses of the word, in which they not only drew visions of the otherworldly, but could see with clarity a new purpose for their art and lives. The modern spiritualist movement arrived in Britain in 1852, and its enthusiastic acceptance was helped by 2 activities. One was the craze of table turning, where groups would link hands around a rotating or tilting table, just like the spiritual seances that came later. It was a popular parlor game where even Queen Victoria would join in on the odd occasion. There was also a fascination with mesmerism, commonly called animal magnetism, which originated with the work of Anton Mesmer in the 18th century, but arrived in Britain from France in the late 1830s. It scientifically presented demonstrations held in hospital lecture halls, but also in popular entertainment venues such as village fairs, theatres, and even private drawing rooms, meant it reached huge audiences, spreading news of the sensation across the country. It was a successful format later adopted by the spiritualists. Usually, a mesmerist would place a person in a trance state in order to heal them of their ailments, but it soon became evident that other spectacles could occur. Often, there would be a display of seemingly superhuman feats of clairvoyance or demonstrations of creative mastery, such as speaking in other languages, singing, drawing, or reciting poetry. According to Professor William Gregory's book, Animal Magnetism, which was published in 1851, the clairvoyance consisted of several stages depending on the depth of the mesmeric state. These stages included the mesmerized person having a vision of themselves from a distance or being able to see objects and people who were not in the same room as them. They were also able to read thoughts and experience intravision, where they would be able to see inside the body to help diagnose disease. And rarest of all was prevision, in which the future could be seen. Our first 2 featured women here. Anna Mary Howitt-Watts and Georgiana Houghton were just 2 of the many that were enthralled with mesmerism. As a young woman in the mid-1840s, Anna saw firsthand its power when her parents invited their friends of literary and scientific distinction to partake in evenings full of mesmeric marvels. Georgiana went as far as to learn the role of mesmerist and would often be called upon to alleviate the pain of her family and friends. She would later adopt the practice to induce trance states in members of her circle in order to facilitate their mediumship. Mediumistic art owes a debt to mesmerism because it shone a light on a young German visionary called Friederike Hauff, who from childhood had the ability to see spirits. Suffering from nervous problems and convulsions, she became a patient in 1826 of the poet and physician Dr. Justinus Kerner. Highly sensitive, she responded well to mesmeric treatment, and in the process continued her spiritual insights, but through a highly skilled artistic process that she was unaware of possessing. Entirely by hand, with jaw-dropping speed and astonishing mathematical precision, Friederike was able to draw geometric circles which formed a series of sun and life sphere drawings where the spirit world interdiffused with the world we inhabit. She became an influential precursor to British mediumistic art after an account of her life, the Series of Provence, was translated into English in 1845 at the height of mesmerism's popularity. Anna Howitt would later describe it as a handbook for the student of clairvoyance, mesmeric phenomena, and communication with the spirit world. Friederike's drawings, alongside those of her contemporary William Blake, would have a far-reaching effect on the early spiritualists who experimented as drawing mediums. Frederica's aptitude for automatic drawing in geometric forms could be seen as paving the way for the more abstract elements in mediumistic art, whilst Blake was an obvious precursor to the more figurative style. Thanks in part to Houghton and Blake, spiritualism was particularly appealing to those of a creative mind who could use art as a language for communication with another realm. However, it was a movement that was also attractive for many other reasons. Most obvious was that it offered the chance to communicate with deceased loved ones, and in Victorian Britain, with high mortality due to illness and bad living conditions, bereavement was a part of everyday life. For many, this was a gateway to psychic belief, which was no exception for Anna and Georgiana, who by the time they joined the movement in its fledgling years in the 1850s, they'd both suffered the loss of several siblings. Spiritualism was also a movement with a reputation of being open to all, something that was unrivaled in Victorian society at that time. It welcomed everyone, regardless of religion, wealth, health, age, gender, and social status. And with its lack of religious dogma, members could even remain faithful to their religious upbringing, which they encouraged to unite with their newfound spiritualist belief. Georgiana was one of many that promptly declared herself as Christian spiritualist, expounding her belief that one only enhanced rather than hindered the other. Religion was having a hard time in this period, which saw its position of power diminishing due to the rising belief in scientific empiricism and materialism, which was fueled in part by Charles Darwin's ideas of evolution. Spiritualism's belief in the survival of consciousness and communication with invisible beings, supported by evidential proof, offered a sanctuary from these mounting conflicts, enabling supporters on each side to pursue their interests in an amicable way. It was particularly appealing for those interested in science who didn't want to lose all vestiges of their metaphysical in their lives. Most important for visionaries like Anna and Georgiana was that women flourished under spiritualism, not only because they were deemed to be more sensitive and therefore would make better mediums, but because they were encouraged to take prominent roles on the councils of the various spiritualist societies and were influential contributors to the spiritualist press. Regardless of social status, women had found a voice in the spiritualist movement, and it soon became synonymous with women's rights. Anna, a true feminist at heart, personified the union of spiritualism and feminism. The paltry high heels and whalebone supports of mere drawing room conventionality were anathema to her, so to find equality without losing one jot or one tittle of our womanly spirit was in her mind a perfect community. She was already putting her womanly spirit to good use by joining forces with her activist friend and fellow artist Barbara Beaudeschon. They pursued action for women's reforms, which became known as the Cause, by gathering thousands of signatures for a petition to reclaim the property and earnings that in the event of marriage by law became their husbands. It wasn't successful when it was first presented in Parliament in 1856, but in effect it was the catalyst that propelled the British feminist movement forward. More campaigns followed, with the establishment of the Society of Female Artists and the English Woman's Journal, whose headquarters in central London led to it being known as the Langham Place Group. It became a centre with the aim of fighting for women's rights, and particularly with unemployment, and would go down in history as the beginnings of women's suffrage in Britain. An art society at the very centre of the feminist movement was an important development for artists like Anna. With the lack of equal opportunities in training, exhibiting, and selling their art, women felt that they were unfairly disadvantaged. Anna hankered for a beautiful sisterhood in art, where they could find success on a par with men. But sadly, her dreams were thwarted after the critic John Ruskin criticised her work in 1856, leaving a devastated Anna already battling with the heartbreak of a broken relationship to destroy most of her artworks. Anna's artwork on the slide here is part of a diptych from 1855, and it is one of less than a handful of works that has survived this tragic period in her life. To Anna's rescue, became the refuge of spiritualism and the creative life of a drawing medium. It was a path that baffled her close friends who did not understand her fascination with what they saw as mere scribble-scrabbles. But for Anna, it was so much more. Spiritualism gave a platform for her art to be placed center stage, equal with men, and as a fully recognized method of spirit communication. Anna's first attempts were crudely executed in the summer of 1856, to her complete astonishment. I had not then heard that such a thing anywhere in the world existed as drawing by spiritual power, she said. But the more I pondered, the more pregnant did it appear to be with the coming birth of a new day of art. And with this exciting discovery, Britain's first mediumistic artist, the first pioneer of a new sisterhood of visionary women in art, had begun her journey. Several of Anna's early drawings were published in 1857 under the name Comfort in a spiritualist publication called Light in the Valley. Using a pseudonym could indicate hesitancy of associating her name with this fledgling movement. And when you look at the reception it received in the press, it proved to be a wise decision. We can only imagine how a sensitive person like Anna reacted when she read that her drawings were the vilest imitation of old medieval designs executed as ill as possible. Another article went further, saying that many will find spiritualism a halfway house on the road to Bedlam, and we firmly believe this book is a dangerous production. It was obvious that the path was not going to always run smoothly for the drawing mediums. As the first mediumistic artist in Britain, it's not surprising that Anna's spirit art set some of the ground rules for subsequent drawing mediums. It became the norm for spirit drawings not to bear the signature of the artist, but instead the name of the guiding force, or with no signature at all. Protecting the identity of the medium was one benefit, but it also enforced the notion that the medium was only a messenger and not the sole originator of the work. Anna had three main guides: William Blake, Fra Angelico, and Raphael, which reflected the triumvirate of past masters that she admired and that she had faith in to assist her in nurturing a new art for the future. Georgiana would later follow suit when she believed that she too had been guided by masters such as Correggio and Titian. But why female drawing mediums would subdue their own voices by placing themselves at the service of great men in art history is puzzling. It's possible that under the guidance of a man, they could embrace a rare opportunity for their metaphysical art to be at a more serious purpose, and thus be able to avoid the usual destiny of women's art, which was mere decoration for the drawing room. Like the trance mediums who would give their great orations to large audiences in the name of a male spirit guide, but often with underlining, inspiring messages for the women in their audience, Anna's art would often place a divine feminine as the central figure. This was remarked upon in one account of her work that said, hints of a woman's word seem to be thrown out ever and again in these designs, revealing a divine wisdom or a female hypostasis of deity. Anna's drawings may have been guided by men, but the message was undoubtedly feminine. Anna was not alone for long in her artistic communication with the spirit world. Another prominent spiritualist family, the Wilkinsons, had lost a son, aged 10, and soon after, in 1857, several members of the family began to draw with the belief that it was he who was communicating with them. Whilst William Nicholson, a respected scholar and solicitor, achieved only rudimentary attempts, describing his hand as running away in spiral forms like the flywheel of an engine, it was the creations of the mother, Elizabeth, that were most surprising and prompted her husband to write a book on the subject. Spirit Drawings was published in 1858, and by the time the second edition was published in 1864, it was said that in the region of 2,000 people had seen the drawings. Elizabeth was the first to exhibit spirit drawings in the mainstream arena when two of her works were shown at the Society of Female Artists in 1859. Elizabeth's geometric and organic representations of unusual flower forms came to the bemused attention of the London Daily News, who found themselves at a complete loss when trying to explain them. The Cambridge Chronicle suggested they should be sent back to dreamland by the very next train. Welcoming a public audience for her spirit art and inspiring others to take up the activity gives Elizabeth an important role in the history of spirit art. Sadly, today, not one of her drawings has survived. One of the women she inspired was Georgiana Houghton. After seeing Elizabeth's drawings in 1859, Georgiana was determined to contact her beloved sister Zillah. She embarked on regular seances with her mother, and after a considerable time, her perseverance paid off when in 1861, small pencil strokes followed by organic flower forms were achieved. She was guided at first by an artist called Henry Lennie, and then by several past masters, followed by 70 archangels that would guide her in 10 sets of 7. While she acknowledged this artistic guidance, she remained steadfast that the guides were using her own strengths in art as well as their own, and unusually for mediumistic art, listed her name as the hand that painted them, followed by those that helped her. Georgiana went on to produce in the region of 155 vibrant and largely abstract watercolors that would anticipate by half a century the beginnings of modern abstract art. In a bold act with the aim of attracting others to spiritualism, she single-handedly arranged a groundbreaking solo show of her spirit drawings from May to October 1871 in New Bond Street, London. At its opening, Georgiana was dressed resplendent in a robe of the softest grey, which shimmered star-like in her finest hour. For the next 4 months, she appeared daily, armed with her magnifying glass, and sat patiently in her day bonnet, posing as any other visitor, but waiting to enlighten a curious mind about her spiritualistic treasures. Houghton had hoped that by reaching out to the mainstream art world, she would inspire others to develop her delightful gift, believing that those with an artistic bent were best positioned to become great drawing mediums. The impact of this extraordinary exhibition, way ahead of its time for women and for spirit art, will never truly be known. It may have been a financial disaster, but it was a triumph in the cause of visionary women and the pinnacle of Georgiana's career as a spirit artist. Anna and Georgiana were inspirational in their work as pioneering mediumistic artists, but sadly, in 1884, their work was cut short. Within weeks of the inaugural meeting of the London Spiritualist Alliance, now known as the College of Psychic Studies, of which both women were founding members, Georgiana suffered a fatal stroke, and Anna succumbed to diphtheria. The spiritualist movement had lost 2 of their brightest stars, but would undoubtedly benefit from their considerable legacies. Anna, along with the accolade of Britain's first mediumistic artist, did much to bring to life the history of the spiritualist movement. Her many articles and book, Pioneers of the Spiritual Reformation, are invaluable research for all of us in the field of psychic studies, and her role as a disseminator of knowledge, which later in life she concentrated on more and more, was one of her major achievements. Georgiana will also be remembered for her unstinting support of a movement that had given a middle-aged, middle-class spinster without financial means the opportunity to take a prominent role in Victorian society. As a respected equal, she was invited to sit on councils with the rich and powerful and was in great demand as a host and guest at many of the home circles at that time. She was also instrumental in spreading the word on the latest spiritual phenomenon, spirit photography, which with her art formed the basis of her 3 books that she published in the last 2 years of her life. Sadly, a 4th that she was working on when she died was never published. Anna and Georgiana should also be remembered for helping others to develop their skills as drawing mediums. One example was Barbara Honeywood, who would receive portions of Georgiana's painting rags imbued with spiritual power to help inspire her when drawing. And Alice Perry frequently sought encouragement from her mentor. Both these women became wonderful mediumistic artists, obviously benefiting from the help Georgiana generously offered. But in a noteworthy reversal of the sexes, Anna and Georgiana were both called upon to bestow the power of drawing mediumship to men. Anna's grasp of Robert Henry Rippon's arm was enough for him to acquire the gift that would go on to make him famous as an entomologist and illustrator. Likewise, Georgiana helped Henry Collin, a professional miniaturist painter who counted Queen Victoria as one of his clients. He was grateful to Georgiana for her help in his psychic development and described her as being a fine preceptress with great power. This artistic role reversal under the auspices of spiritualism was yet another example of how women artists took on new roles seldom offered in the mainstream art world. With Anna and Georgiana no longer with us, a new generation of visionary women stood poised to continue their work. They joined at an interesting period in the history of spirit-inspired art. They found themselves in a maelstrom of scientific, esoteric, and artistic conversions, where each group was striving to go beyond the boundaries of the physical realm and investigate the invisible. It was their aim to make a metaphysical world visible. Some of these explorations were of particular interest for the drawing mediums, who noticed that these recent discoveries often resembled their own work. For them, it was an exciting scientific validation of their art. This slide shows a few examples of these investigations, all of which demonstrate the same colourful, floral, and geometric forms that can be found in mediumistic art. Some of them you'll recognise, like the hugely popular thought forms and the autographs of Annie Besant and Child Ledbetter, or William Röntgen's first X-ray from 1895. But lesser known are the harmonographs created in a mechanical process by oscillating pendulums, which create complex geometric images, of which examples were presented by Samuel Tisley in 1877 to the Royal Society in London, who have been known for their promotion of excellence in science since 1660. There's also the theories of geometric psychology by Benjamin Betts, which were published in 1887 and focused on the evolution of human consciousness, where each stage was represented by geometric diagrams or symbols that unexpectedly took on the appearance of floral forms. Of these stages, the third was psychical, which was shown in three-dimensional, just like the slide here. And the highest stage was the fifth, which was spiritual, and this was the realm of the intuitive knowledge of the supernatural, and only possible to represent in 4 dimensions, of which he thought would be crystalline in nature. The fourth dimension was also a preoccupation with the mathematician Charles Howard Hinton, whose belief that a higher dimensional thought would allow an interconnection between consciousnesses. It was a theory that was closely followed by the spiritualists, who felt it validated their connection to other realms. Hinton visualized the form of the fourth dimension to be what he coined as a tesseract. And he would go on to be hugely influential for people like Ouspensky and Claude Bragdon. Most interesting for me, though, was the voice pictures of trained singer Margaret Watts Hughes, who discovered in 1889 that her voice, with the aid of an idophone, could produce ethereal forms that looked like flowers, shells, and geometric shapes. They caused a sensation when exhibited at the Arts and Craft exhibition in London in 1889. As the new century approached, these forays into the metaphysical were an exciting time, which Annie Besant summed up in her address, The Future That Awaits Us, at the Theosophical Society on November the 25th, 1895. In it, she foresaw changes for art, where so many more colours will then delight the eye, brilliant and vivid of hue, translucent, exquisite and soft, such varieties of changing forms in the astral world, so much more to delineate, to reproduce, for even down in the physical world, the canvas of the painter will glow with the beauties of the astral. She was right in her anticipation of a new direction in art. Abstraction in modern art was on the horizon, and the spiritual world would be its major influence. Annie Besant's prophetic speech was given the same month as little-known artist and music teacher Alice Essington Nelson made her own contribution to the invisible in art. Nelson's only extant work executed on November the 26th, 1895, one day after Besant's speech, shows a complete departure from the traditional landscape she exhibited at the Society of Female Artists. But what caused this change, we do not know. In recent years, she had lost a sister and her mother, so it's likely bereavement would have been a catalyst, but also as a widow and a single mother, she would have been offered a welcoming place in society with the spiritualists. In 1889, she joined the Society of Psychical Research and the London Spiritualist Alliance, and it's possible she saw the art of the early pioneers like Georgiana. But pushing the boundaries further, Alice boldly rejected all remnants of mimetic representation and used geometric forms and colour symbolism to create art that was as extraordinary as the metaphysical world it represented. Alice created her artworks automatically under the guidance of a psychic or spiritualistic force. She described the results as mental horoscopes, where colours symbolise the influences of the planets on human affairs. Around 1902, this picture was donated to the College of Psychic Studies and has found its rightful place, inspiring generations of visionary women ever since. But this year, she also found recognition in the art world, where her art was selected as part of the Women in Abstraction at the Pompidou Show, now on its way to the Guggenheim Bilbao. And that is a remarkable achievement for an artist that hardly anyone has ever heard of. Someone who may have seen Alice's work was the miniaturist painter Florence Seth, who, like Anna, Georgiana, and Alice, was a trained artist. In 1914, just a few weeks before the outbreak of World War I, she exhibited a group of curious artworks that she believed were not hers, but a power from the other side. An article in the Evening Telegraph stated, "They are by no means formless. The difficulty is deciding what the forms are." The exhibition was presented by Percy Kemp Prosser, whose talent for art dealing was complemented by a passion for harmonious colouring and interior design. Inspired by his synesthesia, which manifested as his ability to see colours while listening to music, and he also had a natural talent for identifying auras, he explained that the vibrations of colour in Florence's pictures were the passing of the soul before it reached an angelic state. Florence believed that when she started painting in 1913, that she was being used by a spiritual consciousness distinct from her own that wanted to express a message through her. In October 1914, she held a second exhibition, which sparked interest in the spiritual press, stating that they were futuristic in quality and architecturally dreamlike. One visitor was the poet Ezra Pound. He was the champion of the newly formed Vortices, a group of avant-garde British artists who used abstract art to show the spirit of the modern world. Pound was a contributor to The New Age, a well-respected weekly that investigated the development of modernism in the spiritual arts, in the visual arts. In an outstanding moment, though, for visionary women, Pound published an article on Florence, which gave the subject of spirit-inspired art a hitherto unreached level of recognition in the mainstream art world. Pound's insightful account stated that Florence's paintings were the best automatic paintings he had ever seen. But they were not vortices because they were done without volition and were guided by spirits or some mysterious agency over which the artist had little or no control. Will and consciousness are our vortex, he proudly proclaimed. Later that year, in June 1915, the Vortices presented their first and only group exhibition at the Door Galleries, a series of gallery rooms in Bond Street. And in a remarkable coincidence, one of the other rooms was occupied by Florence's new show, which had begun in May the 18th. These two extraordinary shows of psychic and modern art rubbing shoulders were overshadowed when suffragette Ivy Bond, aged 25, and freshly released from prison where she had been subjected to the barbaric act of force-feeding, sensationally stormed one of the other gallery rooms with an axe. She managed to damage two expensive artworks and injure the gallery assistant before being carted off to jail for a further 6 months imprisonment. Unfortunately, this exciting moment of spiritualism, modernism, and radicalism was short-lived when a series of seriousness of war curtailed their activities. Florence offered her services as an artist of subconscious pictures, but it is not known how successful she was. She presented her only extant work, shown here, to the Élysée in January 1916, where it joined the works of Georgiana, Anna, and Alice. The war was to have a marked effect on spiritualism. In the autumn of 1918, still reeling from its devastating effects, Britain found itself in the depths of a deadly flu pandemic that had killed millions around the world. Both tragic events led to a surge in the popularity of spiritualism, and with it came a new wave of mediumistic artists who discovered their gift at such a challenging time. Among them were Ethel Le Rossignol, Sicily Martin, and Maj Gill, who all began in the period 1919 to 1920. Together they formed a new generation of visionary women set to continue the vanguard of the British visionary art scene. Ethel Le Rossignol was from a wealthy family and lived a life free from worry. However, the war changed this idyllic existence when Ethel volunteered as a nurse in 1914. The horrors she saw must have affected her deeply, and when she returned, she began to paint in a manner that couldn't be more different to her usual style. It resulted in an extraordinary series of over 40 drawings and paintings from 1920 to 33 that she called the Goodly Company. In 1929, Ethel publicly declared her spiritual belief with an address and an exhibition of her works at the London Spiritualist Alliance. For many weeks, these vibrant paintings, symbolizing the energies of the spirit world, shimmered in kaleidoscopic glory in their gilded frames. Cicely Martin, a trained artist from South London, who after years of painting dainty fairy pictures, startled the Society of Women Artists in January 1920 with 4 works created under psychic control. After applying layers of ink, Cicely used her fingers and a knife to rub, scratch, and pierce the paper, creating an ethereal effect when the light shone through from beneath the ink. They caught the attention of the fashionable magazines of the time, like Eve and the Daily Sketch, as well as the spiritualist paper Light, who wrote, "I can safely say these 4 pictures are the pictures of power, so often denied to women's work." Cicely signed her works Candida and described herself as being aghast at her newfound creativity, saying that the scraping and the rubbing that goes on almost shakes her arm off. Cicely's star was in the ascendant, in and out of spiritualist circles, which is all the more sad that when just 2 years later, in March 1922, she was admitted to the workhouse for insanity and was moved to the dreaded Colney Hatch Asylum. She died there a few weeks later at the age of 42. Sadly, spiritualism and insanity were often linked, and the tragic fate of Cicely is a stark reminder that the asylum posed a real threat to spiritualists that lacked the support of their families. Coincidentally, on that day that Cicely died, another mediumistic artist, Maj Gill, was in hospital being treated for a breakdown following a series of harrowing events that began in October 1918 when she lost her beloved son, Reggie. The loss had a profound effect on Maj, who, like many, found their bereavement opened a door to a spiritual awakening. She suddenly began to sing Home Sweet Home at the top of her voice, and feeling inspired, she led her other 2 sons to the garden where she saw a vision of Christ on a cross with angels in the sky. It was an epiphany for Maj, who from that moment felt controlled by a divine power, which was at first a high priest and later a guiding force that she referred to as my inner rest. Unable to stop herself, she began to write, sing, speak, play piano, knit, stitch, weave, and draw brilliant creations, which were in great speed and in a trance-like state. Her son Laurie recalled this pivotal day in their lives when he said, "All that day the medium was in a trance, and no one in the domestic circle knew what spiritualism meant. It caused great awe at the time." It may have been a welcome relief for Laurie and Bob to see their mother's despair replaced with ecstatic exuberance, but her husband did not share their wonderment, and after further severe illnesses and the loss of a stillborn girl, compounded an already fragile situation, he reached out for medical help. One doctor suggested that Maj be admitted to the asylum under the Lunacy Act, but abhorred by the idea, he managed to find her a place as a patient at the Lady Chichester Hospital for Women, a pioneering establishment specializing in the early treatment of nervous disorders. It's sad to think that a similar treatment for Sicily could have saved her from the unfortunate fate of the mainstream asylum. In April 1922, Maj was well again and home, but she hadn't lost her talent for drawing. With no prior knowledge of art, this humble housewife felt an instinctive compulsion to create, resulting in thousands of artworks that flowed effortlessly and spontaneously from an altered state of consciousness. Her work drew admiration from the spiritualists and from wider audiences when she became a popular exhibitor at the Whitechapel Gallery's East End Academy exhibitions, and was frequently singled out for praise in the press. Overcoming the many adversities that life had put in her way, Maj found a refuge and a confidence in her drawing mediumship. Like many of the visionary predecessors, she refused to sell, even though she didn't enjoy the same financial comfort as them. Maj did not think her artworks were hers to sell, but instead they belonged to the spirit realm, whose essence was not to be sullied by financial gain. Benefiting from their psychic gifts could be problematic for professional mediums, as it made them vulnerable to false accusations from disgruntled paying customers. These mediums had to contend with the archaic laws of the Witchcraft Act of 1735, which could imprison those who pretended to exercise a conjuration of spirits, and also the Vagrancy Act of 1824, which was originally aimed at vagabonds and rogues that pretended to tell fortunes for financial gain. And both of these laws were created before the modern spiritualism existed. Unfortunately, they were finally repealed in 1951 after an impassioned speech in Parliament by the spiritualist Lord Dowding. He had stated that the mere claim to be a medium was sufficient to establish an offence. Maj's most remarkable achievement, though, was undoubtedly her fearless attitude when it came to scale of the works. Some of her works reached 36 feet in length, and she once said her aim was to reach 50 feet. But as she was restricted to the length of the material that she bought from the local market, this didn't happen. In November 1938, she submitted to the Whitechapel Gallery a staggering 108 feet of art in the form of 3 large calico pen and ink drawings. These were described as mystic, in the catalogue, as mystic subjects, but it was a bold decision, and they must have had a powerful impact on the visitors. Maj herself had actually never seen them in their entirety due to the limited confines of her house. And it's astonishing to think that Picasso's new masterpiece, Guernica, at 25 feet long, must have looked small in comparison when it was hung in the same position 2 weeks later. Did any of the 15,000 people that stood in front of Guernica during the first week of 1939 compare it to Maj's epic showpiece? No doubt they would have been impressed by her audacious art and fearless nature, and incredibly, her submissions the following year were even longer, reaching 120 feet. Maj wasn't the only person to embrace in the extremes of scale in their art. In 1933, Mary Willis, a tobacconist in her 60s, living in South London and with no artistic training, felt an overwhelming urge to dip her hands into some house paint that was left behind by decorators and paint the interior walls of her house just using her hands. It was reported in one newspaper that her fiancé had died on the eve of her wedding and that the shock had sparked this curious creativity. And in ecstatic state, Mary pushed away the real world. Often without sleeping or eating for days, she would immerse herself in the physical act of painting. Symbolic elements, swirls of color, faces, creatures, mystical elements all emerged from her fingertips. And once the walls were complete, she bought massive canvases, which were often 6 feet to 9 feet in size. And on the advice of her friends who were concerned about her, she started to use brushes instead of her hands. She signed each of her works Laurie Marine in a nod to the power that created them. In May 1935, at the same time that Madge was finding success in the East End, Willis decided to go to the West End and presented her mammoth paintings at the Chesterfield Salon in Mayfair. Her work often contained prophetic nature, which some of them anticipated the Spanish Civil War of 1936 and the impending doom between Italy and Abyssinia in 1935. Like Madge, she believed that within her works were messages that she didn't understand, but they needed to be seen, and by exhibiting them, she could find resolution to these giant outpourings of grief, spiritual enlightenment, and artistic prowess. Spiritualist societies found delight in their unexpected talent. She was compared to El Greco, William Blake, and other masters who could possibly have guided her hand. This success was curtailed with the onset of the Second World War. And Mary wasn't seen again until 1951, when one of her canvases was included in the Festival of Britain's groundbreaking exhibition, Black Eyes and Lemonade, curated by the champion of popular art, Barbara Jones. It was at the Whitechapel that attracted 30,000 visitors when it opened in August 1951. And once again, it was a place where visionary women could inspire a large audience and demonstrate their worth. It was a proud moment and a fitting end for Mary, whose interest in spiritualism stayed with her to the end. She died a few years later in 1954 at the age of 85. For Madge, her last drawing is 1958, and she slipped away from this world in 1961 at the age of 79. I've spoken about 9 incredible women, but they are not alone. But 9 of several hundreds of women who chose the often difficult path of drawing mediumship. We can learn so much from these women who chose to deal with adversity by channeling it into something beautiful. Many have slipped into obscurity with only the finest threads of information to let us know they existed. Just the name of their guide, a mention of an exhibition, or an anonymous artwork waiting for identification, just like the ones here on the slide. It is our task to pull on those threads and weave them into a rich tapestry that tells the story of spirit-inspired art, a category of art that deserves its own genre and should no longer dwell in the shadows of the history of modern art. All of us here can honor these artists and their commitment to their visionary practice, a practice that was frequently misunderstood. We can unleash their dormant energies and aid their inspiration of a new generation of visionary sisters in art.